Hello, everyone. Welcome to Chapter 10, America's Economic Revolution. Okay, here are the highlights. We're going to be talking about the population, which is another way of saying also the labor force, but the developments in transportation, communications, and technology. We talked about this in some of the previous chapters, a little bit alluded to it at least. The developments in industry, and then also then how it changed farming. Okay, first off is the American population 1840 to or 1820 to 1840. Um, at first, or in the early parts, and it's really kind of a tale of almost two eras, that the public health improves and there's a higher natural birth rate. Okay, and that accounts for a large part of the increase. But then after 1830, it's really immigration, and immigration at this time, and this is kind of the storyline. Immigration at this time comes from two different areas, Germany and the Irish. Okay, and there's push-pull factors associated with each. The Germans that come over here tend to have a little bit more money, move to the Northwest. Um, they were victims of industrialization in Europe in terms of they were displaced. The Irish that came over here, on the other hand, tended to have less money. They were pushed here really by the crop failures in Ireland, potato famine, and they tended to stay in New England and they worked in the factories. Okay, graph demonstrating the rapid increase in population. Okay, another graph depicting the total immigration from these eras. Okay, so what we have here is the um, immigration that's coming over. First, it's the rapid urbanization. Again, so the Irish that are coming to the bigger cities, they're going to work in the factories that are popping up. Okay, there's also movement of people from farms to cities. As the agricultural techniques improve, there's just less of a need for farmers, right? They just need fewer people. So what do those people do that previously were on the farm? They get displaced to the cities, and that's an ongoing trend. The population will shift in America from farm to cities all the way up to the 1920s, where finally there's a tipping point and there's more people in the cities. And lastly, again, mention the German and Irish immigrants that came over. This graph gives you a sense of a pie chart gives you a sense of the German and Irish. So you can see if you add that up, 70% of the immigrants coming over from 1820 to 1840 were either German or Irish. This is the settlement patterns and the density in terms of where they lived. Then 1860, you can see that in the Northeast in particular, there's a lot more people that have come there. Okay, of course, well, not of course, but because we have an increase in immigration, we also have the rise of nativism. Okay, nativism are those people that are generally anti-immigrant, don't want immigrants in this country. And resulting from that, you have the rise of the Know Nothing Party. Okay, the Know Nothing parties, they are an anti-immigrant. They're like a one issue party. They're anti-immigration. Okay, so when they asked them, what do you know? They said, I know nothing. Okay, and that was kind of their secret code at first. They did have some success, Pennsylvania, New York, Massachusetts. They had some success there, won some public offices. Unfortunately, they actually had to govern, and so they didn't last very long. Okay, I'm sorry. And one other feature of the Know Nothing Party is that they were anti-Catholic. Okay, so why were people against immigration? In part, and this is probably true going throughout history. So when there's excessive waves of immigration, a lot of the reasons will be the same. It's just applied to a different group. Okay, and we can talk about that in our discussions. One, they saw those people as inferior, and usually that's associated with culture or their culture and how they did things. Um, Related to that, they're uncivilized, and part of the problem is that people in America, but people in general, I think, have a hard time separating people's behaviors from like their economic status, right? So if you can't afford to have different types of silverware, you just might use the same fork to eat everything. People might call you uncivilized, but really it's just a lack of money and resources that prevents you from doing that. Okay. They also accuse them of stealing jobs. Okay, so often the immigrants, because they're more desperate, would come over here and be willing to work for less money. And at that time, there are no rules against. There's no minimum wage. There's no rules in terms of how you treat your workers, and so immigrants were um, more willing to deal with that kind of abuse just because they're tended to be in a more desperate situation. Anti-Catholic, this is a big one because the religion, Irish in particular, are Catholic, and so most of the Americans that came over here are Protestant and still are Protestant. So there's a lot of anti-Catholic sentiment that goes on. Some of the folks that came over here, particularly the Germans, came over with some more radical ideas about government, society, and then lastly, the political corruption. And so, because these immigrants didn't know what they're doing necessarily in terms of democracy, they were taken advantage of by the political machines. And because they were taken advantage by the political machines, other folks tended to blame the immigrants for the corruption, really when it was probably uh, the people that were manipulating them. Okay, and that gives a comparison today. Again, this is probably better done in a live discussion as opposed to when we talk about immigration today. Are the reasons the same? So, resentment against immigration, do they fall largely along the same lines? Maybe not the anti-Catholic part, but some of the other ideas. Okay, shows you the immigration patterns. Same thing. Okay, so pivoting here towards transportation, communications, technology. Again, we raised this in one of the earlier chapters. There's development of roads. The government builds the old national road. You can see stretching across the kind of mid-Atlantic region. Not very effective, okay? Even though the government built it, not very effective. It's just one road. There's no real branching off of it, so it had limited effectiveness in terms of its ability to impact the economy. There were private roads, the turnpikes. Um, Turnpikes were also largely ineffective because most people did not want to pay to go on the turnpikes. Kind of like today when you're driving to Cedar Point, if you notice, you have the option to take the toll road or you can take the public highway. Okay, and I don't know what your parents do, but some people don't want to take the toll roads because they don't want to pay money. On top of that, the other thing that's really limited the effectiveness of the roads is that you were limited by how much you could haul, how much weight, essentially, how much you could haul on the turnpikes. Okay, the canal age. Okay, so the canal, let me just fast forward through this, and if you get a chance, if you look up on YouTube, America, the Story of Us, they have a nice reenactment of the building of the Erie Canal. So the Erie Canal became an immediate success. Okay, and the advantage of the Erie Canal, it connected essentially the Great Lakes to the Atlantic. Okay, and so by building a canal, you can now, between the use of rivers and the canal that cut across, um, you could ship in things from Europe and get it to the Great Lakes. Okay, and this really has the impact of making New York the leading port in the world, um, leading port in the United States for sure, surpassing New Orleans. Also with the steamboats you could travel upstream now, and I think we mentioned that before. So just to give you a sense of it, four horses and a cart, they could before carry essentially a ton and a half, about 18 miles per day. With a steamboat, you can now ship 100 tons, 24 miles a day. Okay, and the basic rule of thumb here is that the more you can transport, and for the cheaper, it's going to lead to cheaper products. Okay, we see that today with a lot of goods being produced overseas, your t-shirts and shorts, or t-shirt, shorts, tennis shoes, electronics. You can produce them overseas because it is much, much cheaper to send them back to the United States. Okay, this would be the YouTube video of the Erie Canal that you can look up, but it looks like that. Okay, and so here's the Erie Canal. So you come in here, you sail up the river, Erie Canal brings you across over the Great Lakes, and then you can deposit your goods over there. Okay, and because the canal was such a great success, they actually started building a lot of canals out in the Midwest area, what they call the West. These canals were less successful. Okay, Erie Canal was very successful, almost immediately successful. The ones out in the West were less successful. Okay, the other thing that we have developing at this time is the early railroads. Okay, and so the early railroads, and this is important to keep in mind, early railroads were not as successful in terms of impacting the economy. Okay, part of the challenge of the early railroads, one, the gauge sizes, so the width of the actual tracks, were not standardized. Okay, and my joke for this, but some of you guys know what I'm talking about, is it's kind of like when you buy the Legos and then you know someone gives you the knockoff Legos and that they don't match, right? And because they don't match, you can't really use them together. Or you know, you had your Thomas the Tank engine tracks and the knockoff ones, and they don't really line up. Same thing with the railroads at that time. Okay, because the rails don't match up, you really could only be on your railroad line. Okay, the lines were short, and typically any railroads that did exist at this time really were just to help move stuff over closer to the canals, and the canals were more efficient. However, in the 1850s and 60s, the railroads will begin to consolidate into trunk lines. So there will be one main railroad line, and there'll be branches off it. That's why it's called a trunk line. Okay, the impact of the railroads, and this is part of the story of the United States. It will begin to bind the North and West together. Okay, so you have three major regions, North, West, and South. This will begin to bind the North and West together, alienating the South. Okay, it was paid for by public and private money, some land grants, but this really gives rise to Chicago. So Chicago helped process agricultural goods, grains, whiskey, leather goods, and actually will become more important as we settle further west as a hub to send stuff back east. Okay, this gives you an example. So the different colors of the different rail line or the different gauge sizes. Okay, and how difficult that would be in terms of trying to get across the country because the rail sizes continually change. So it's not very useful. Okay, other developments in communications journalism, the telegraph. And so the telegraph is just a quicker way to communicate. Um, you can transmit messages quickly across the wire lines, and later those will be strung up around the rail lines. And because you can get information out quicker, you get the rise of the Associated Press, okay, um, which will make information available instead of in days, in a matter of hours. This has the impact of really fueling sectional discord in the North. So the North will have greater access to information because they tend to have more of the railroads, again, to the exemption of the South. Okay, this slide is actually not from Garrity, but I think it would be useful for kind of helping understand the big picture in terms of how the economy develops. And so, roughly 10,000 years ago, when we're all farmers, that kind of dictated how our society was organized, what type of government we had, what type of family structures we had, and the size of our families, as well as what type of education was needed. And what happens, and starting in England mid 1700s and in the US later 1700s, early 1800s, we begin to transition from farming to factories. Okay. And so that's what people are literally moving off the farms, working in factories. The people that are immigrating here to America are working in the factories. And again, this will change some of the government, you know, how the government operates, the families, education levels, and we've seen it a little bit, but it's a slow-moving process throughout these chapters. So I don't know if you've necessarily picked up on that. And just kind of looking ahead into the future, what happens beginning 1950s, probably here in the United States, we're transitioning to a knowledge economy. Okay, so typically age of computers, age of science, engineering, and people are moving out of the factories, not literally in a generation, but over the generations, and into knowledge work. Okay, and so are there still farmers here in America? Yes. Are there still factories here in America? Yes. Far fewer of each one. I think farming is about 2%, manufacturing is about 13%, and much more larger sector of knowledge workers. Okay, so that's kind of how the economy of the U.S. will unfold. Okay, along with that, then this is what happens in a um, factory economy. Okay, in a manufacturing type economy. Typically, actually it's what happens elsewhere too, I guess. What happens is some company or some industry, or usually some company will develop a new technique, a new product, and they will make a lot of profits from that. Okay, so when you think about the Apple iPhone when it first came out, made a lot of money, easy to use, highly profitable, and they expand. Okay, and they grow and they get big. What happens is because that company is making so much money, um, it will invite competition. Other companies will jump in and they will see how much money is being made, and they will say, "Why don't we do that?" And one of the things I usually talk about in class is if you ask yourself what kind of company is Microsoft, people think of Microsoft. It is a computer software company, right? They don't make computers, but they do make the software for Microsoft Office, Microsoft Word, um, operating systems. But if you stop and think about it, Microsoft also makes the Xbox. And so why do they make the Xbox is because there's a lot of money to be made off of gaming systems. Wildly popular, wildly profitable, they jumped in. Okay, even though that's not their main business. What happens because you have competition, competition will drive down the prices. Okay, and because it drives down prices, some companies can't keep up and they go bust. Okay, and after they go bust, other companies will begin to buy them up. And so concentration is we will go from 10 companies down to 2 or 3 companies. So certainly when you think of like airlines, there's probably like 3 or 4 major airlines. When you think of pop, right, you think of Pepsi and Coke. There's other pop companies, but they're very, very small, and they tend to get swallowed up by the big two. Okay, so before industrialization, how did we used to do things? It used to be through the household system. So what would happen is somebody would drop off a bag of sock parts. Okay, these are the different sock parts. You would sew them together, and they'd be back in a week and pick up the finished socks and maybe drop off another bag of sock parts. Okay, or if it was a skilled trade, so that you'd have a master and apprentice relationship. So the master, you would study under him for, I don't know, 2 years, 5 years, whatever, and then you would become the master, and you might take on your own apprentice. So typically that's how things were done. What happens is we get the expansion of corporations at this time period, 1820, 1840. Before it was difficult to incorporate from state legislators. You had to go to each state legislator and they had to approve your corporation. And people thought corporations were cheating. Okay, because in a corporation, and this is why you would incorporate, you only risk your investment, not your personal wealth. And what that means is if I put $100,000 into starting a company and the company goes bankrupt, I lose my $100,000, but they can't come take my personal house, my personal car, um, my personal cat. They can only take the business assets. And so people thought that was unfair because if you stand a chance to become really rich through your work, then you should also risk everything that you have. Okay. So initially, corporations are not very popular and they're very difficult to start up. So the other part of the other challenge of not being incorporated was it's difficult to raise money. So you think about building a factory. So from the physical building to the land to the machines that you need, it takes a lot of money. And most people individually don't have that much money to start a factory on their own. Okay, and so fact it was just out of the reach of most folks. But because um, but because now they can get credit, they can bank loans. It's easier to start factories. Okay, so it starts off, it talks about the shoe industries. Here's a funny thing to think about. So before there was no shoes, there was no right and left shoe. You just had shoes. Okay, but as you begin to make more, you can specialize, and now there's right and left shoes. Um, Most of the factories are centered in New England. Okay, and part of that is due to again the rise of the textile industries up in New England, but also because many of the early factories will be powered by water, and there's more water, more rivers available in New England to be able to power those. That will become a game changer later when we discover coal, because now you don't have to build it near the water, and then obviously oil later. Okay, advanced in technology that helped. Eli Whitney with the interchangeable parts. So if something breaks, you can just change the part as opposed to getting a whole new something. So I think Eli Whitney's original breakthrough was with like rifles. So if you're like the trigger broke on your rifle, you would just have to junk the whole rifle. Now you can just swap out the trigger. Okay, and of course to do that you have to standardize it. Also, we get rubber sewing machine. I mentioned the coal already. So these are all technological advances that help fuel economic growth. Okay, so what does that mean? Who's going to come work in the factories? I mentioned this already. Farm life changes, so they will be coming. There's a um, population movement from the farms to the cities. Initially, one of the first attempts to, and this is one of your readings that you'll have, one of the first attempts is to bring girls off the farm. Okay, so the Lowell system is they recruit girls off the farm because girls aren't needed on the farm anymore. And frankly, for them, it sounds more exciting to go live somewhere else and be adventurous as opposed to just sitting on the farm. And so initially, the Lowell system, their intent is to build this industrial utopia that you can make profit and still treat people well. What eventually happens to the Lowell system is kind of that um, the transformations that I walked you through. It makes money, but then prices drop, and then they have to cut wages. They have to speed up the machines. They go on strike, and then it goes bust. Okay, so despite the attempt to be better, they weren't able to. Okay, so what happens with uh, the labor force and who replaces the mill girls? It's immigrant labor. Okay, and the advantages of immigrant labor, and this is really after 1840. You can pay them less. There's a whole bunch of them, so if someone gets hurt, it's okay. You can just replace them with somebody else. And they switch in part of the paying them. They paid them by piece. So there's different ways to get people to work harder. Piece rate is like you get paid per piece that you make, so that way you can get them to work hard consistently. And what happens now with industrialization, bring this all the way back. If you think back to Jefferson, if you remember Jefferson's vision for this country was that we're going to be a nation of farmers, right? We don't need a strong central government because we're going to live in the village with farmers. There might be some artisans there making your horseshoes or whatever else you need, a tailor or a cobbler. Industrialization destroys that, right? So the person that's sewing shirts individually, making custom made shirts, won't be able to compete with the prices of an industrial made shirt. Okay, person that's making shoes um, by hand won't be able to compete with the factory that's making shoes. So that dream of us being a nation of farmers and artisans is dead. Okay, and of course that means for the factory workers also, you lose your status. Okay, so it's not special. You're not special to be farmer John that grows things out of the ground, or blacksmith Bob that makes things. Now you're just the worker. You're one out of thousands in the factories. Okay, the response to this typically is to form trade unions. Trade unions at this time, they thought that was unfair. So workers getting together to ask for better conditions and higher wages, they thought it was unfair. There's actually a Supreme Court case, the Commonwealth versus Hunt, which legalizes unions, but unionizing is difficult. Okay, and what makes unionizing difficult, because and this going back to labor. So if you aren't happy at work, and this is true today, this is what you can do. You can go out and get a new job. So you don't like working at McDonald's, go get a job at Burger King. Okay, you can go get a new skill. So you don't like working at McDonald's, learn to be a plumber, and now you can be a plumber instead of working at McDonald's. Or thirdly, you can unionize. So if you get together all the other workers and say, hey, we should be making more money, the boss is making a lot more money, and people are like, yes, that's how you can improve your wages, improve your working conditions. Okay, I mentioned the Commonwealth versus Hunt, where it legalizes unions. The hard part at this time is that the Americans working class is divided. Okay, and so unions are pretty ineffective. Some of that reason is that the really unhappy folks can always leave. You can move west, and we talked about that. So if you want to reinvent yourself, start your life over again, you move west. They're also ineffective because they didn't include women in part, so that automatically divides part of your labor force. The unions didn't have any political power like the industrialists, like the capitalists. So if you're the factory owner, you might, donate money to your senator or representative, to your mayor or governor. The unions didn't typically do that. And the workers did not do that. Okay, and so free labor at this point was difficult. In the South, their retort anytime slavery was criticized, they would say the North is just practicing a form of wage slavery, and they would say we're not, you're not any better, at least this is from the South's perspective. At least, we feed and clothe and care for our slaves. You just use them, and if they get hurt, then you just discard them. Okay. So what else made unionizing difficult? And this will be true throughout U.S. history, to some degree, I guess. There's no class consciousness. So the people didn't think of themselves as a working class. They thought maybe this is a temporary, I'll be here 2 years and I'll be somewhere else. So they didn't think of themselves as a working class, a permanent working class. Also, they tended to identify by ethnicity, so it made it harder to organize them. Right. So if you think of yourself as Irish and I think of myself as German, what do we have in common? And if you see yourself in terms of ethnicity, the answer is nothing. Okay. And I mentioned already, frontier is the safety valve. And so for the really, really unhappy folks at work, they will leave. And of course, that will bring up the problem. Once the frontiers closed in 1890, where did the unhappy people go to today? Okay. And that's part of the struggle. Okay, so what is the effect of this growing economy? The wealth gap. The wealth gap grows. Okay, and so you have this real divide between rich and the poor. So the rich, they have private clubs, they have mansions, um, they have green space. The poor, they tend to live in crowded housing, more subject to crime. Um, more subject to disease and dirty conditions. Okay, for African Americans, they are in poverty. Okay, still a lot of discrimination, even in the North. So people tend to think of like slavery's in the South and they treated people badly, but in the North there's a lot of discrimination as well. Okay, so the new middle class life. So again, growing economy. There's people in the middle class. Okay, and the classical definition of middle class is you have leisure time, you have disposable income, you own property, you have access to quality education and healthcare. And so one of the signs of expanding middle class is that that you own this cast iron stove here. That's what that is. Okay. That you have an ice box. Okay. And those are all conspicuous signs of wealth. Okay. People, you saw that in somebody's house, you know that they're wealthy. Today, I don't know if they have a 70-inch TV, maybe that's a sign. Or you have a fridge that's connected to the internet. You guys can answer that question for yourself. Okay, changing family because again, there's more wealth being created. We don't need kids to work. You don't need as many kids, so there's a um, falling birth rate, and now the question is, what's going to happen with the mom? Da, 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 da. That will come up in the upcoming chapters. No, actually, it's coming up here. So women in the cult of domesticity, there's a new role for women, and because they're not needed in the workplace, there's a separate sphere created for them. Okay, and their separate sphere is they're expected to be at home, and we'll have an article about this, but they're supposed to be pious and pure, and domestic and submissive. Okay, men are supposed to go out to work, women are supposed to stay at home. And of course, this is only true if you are middle class, a woman in a middle class family, because working class women still work. Okay, other signs of wealth that you have leisure time and you have money, disposable income to take advantage of that. So you have the rise of minstrel shows. Okay, this is a sign of wealth. House with rug, decorations on the wall, decorations on the fireplace mantle, fancy furniture. Sign of not wealth, where you have no decorations, no rugs, plain walls. Okay, so what happens in the north? The impact of this is when you trade, and remember this was kind of Hamilton's vision. When you trade, that allows you to specialize. So if Canada, if Canada just what do they do? If Canada just makes maple syrup, and we build cars here in the United States, we can trade, and because we trade, that allows us to specialize. And because we're only doing one thing, if we're just making cars here in the U.S. or if they're just making maple syrup in Canada, we will become more efficient. Okay. And once you become more efficient, you'll literally be able to create more of anything. And that more stuff that's created is wealth creation. And that's literally how you become richer. It's not always working harder, although that's part of it. It's also becoming more efficient. And so you stop and think about it. Technology in a lot of ways has made us become more efficient. Having a cell phone in your pocket where you can always be reached has made people more efficient. It also has its drawbacks because now you're constantly working, but same principle applies. Okay, so in terms of farming, um, you get developments in farming too. So the mechanical reaper, the steel plow, and the thresher, these are all implements that make farming more efficient. Okay, so especially the steel plow can cut through the thicker sod in the Midwest. But the thresher and the reaper, it really does make farming quicker. You need fewer people now because you can have the work of the horses and the machines. And so how does that impact farming? Or just to give you an idea, the reaper, one worker could now do the job of 5 workers. Okay, and farming can actually become profitable. With the thresher, before you can harvest 7 bushels a day. Now with a mechanical thresher, you can harvest 25 bushels a day. And so that leads to agricultural specialization. Okay, we talked about technology, and my thing is a little bit out of order. So what can farms do now in the Northeast? Because they don't need to grow those crops, they can grow wheat in the Midwest. They can grow corn in the Midwest. You don't need to grow them in the Northeast. You get truck farming, and truck farming is it's growing of fruits and vegetables, more specialized fruits and vegetables. And the reason why you want to grow them in the Northeast, why they grow them in the Northeast, one, remember there's more people coming there, more people living in the big cities, and two, the fruits and vegetables that they grow, they would spoil. So there's no way you can grow fruits out in the Midwest and ship them back east. They would go bad by the time they got there. But now, because you don't need to grow wheat in the Northeast, you can specialize and you get more money by growing fresh fruits and vegetables. Okay, so that's the impact even of technology um, on farms. Okay, so the big takeaway from this unit at this time period, what's happening, it will bind the North and West together. Again, kind of alienates the South. The North and West will become dependent on one another. So West is the breadbasket, North is like the manufacturing hub of America. It'll also shift the balance of political power because more people are moving to the Northeast and to the North overall. They will get more representatives, and again, much to the dismay of the South, and that's the big fear. So if the Senate wasn't there, slavery might have disappeared a long time ago, because the House is becoming dominated by the North. There are new markets created because you can ship things further now. So there are new markets. So you think about the Great Lakes as a market now for not only European goods, but goods produced out east. Okay. There's a backlash against immigrants with this nativist movement that we will see in this country. Some will argue even to today. The nature of work changes. Again, we're off the farm and we're into the factories, and what that does, that will have an effect on, and this is really going to point 6, the social changes. Because it's the man primarily going off to work, women are staying at home. More people have better lives to some degree, right? You think about the rise of the middle class. Not everyone, but more people. It will really have an impact on society and social roles for women and for children. Okay. So hopefully you enjoyed today's lecture. Don't forget to buy the merch, and we will see you next time.